design, which I'm going to do a lot, means thank you for your time. Thank you for doing this. And I wanted
Yeah.
to begin, to make sure I'm respectful of your time, to ask you about your particular line of research. How do you get interested in body composition, in energy expenditure? Can you give us a little bit of your background?
Yeah, so I'll say that before I was ever an academic researcher, I was interested in fitness for my own, my own fitness endeavor. So starting back when I was, 11 or 12 years old, I began to get interested in, how we could change our body composition through exercise, got interested in lifting weights and so on. So, I was someone who practiced, fitness and played sports. I didn't really know what I was doing in terms of my time in the gym, my nutrition, all of that as a teenager, but it's certainly something I was interested in. And I always loved science as well. So when I went to university, it was kind of a natural choice to study the human body. So I studied physiology and nutritional sciences. I was also exposed to a lot of people who knew a lot more about lifting than I did. So I was able to interact with people who had lifted for sports and had a lot more practical experience than I did. So it was, learning a lot there, and it was a nice situation where what I was learning academically was complementing what I was, just learning in the gym from being there. So I began to, develop these interests. In terms of the actual line of research, I, again, studied physiology and nutritional sciences as an undergraduate student. I was doing research, but it was all rodent research, and I didn't really enjoy it. It was a lot of dissecting mice, lots of benchtop work, and it wasn't directly related to fitness. So I wasn't sure if I really liked research. So I decided to get a master's degree in biomedical sciences, and it really focused on anatomy and physiology. So I spent a lot of time dissecting human cadavers, and that gave me a new appreciation for the human body in a way I didn't have before. So from there, I decided I didn't want to be done with school. I still wasn't sure what I ultimately wanted to do, but I decided to look into PhD programs. And there was a PhD program that combined the exercise side that I was interested in with the nutrition side I had studied formally. So it's sort of a perfect program for me. And it was in that program that I became very interested in human research. And I realized for me how much more fun human research was than rodent research. Because of my first advisor during my PhD program, I began to get interested in intermittent fasting. And that was kind of one of the first areas I began researching. And as we were assessing people's body composition in these intermittent fasting studies, I began to get curious about the details of these methods, how accurate they were, how we could improve the quality of the data we get from these methods. So it's just sort of from asking questions and considering these issues that I developed this love of body composition assessment. And I just love body composition because it has ties in with exercise, with nutrition, with technology and data analysis. It just combines a lot of the areas I'm interested in. And then, of course, it has implications for health, disease, athletic performance, and so on. So it's kind of a short summary of how I got interested in those areas. And since then, the interest has just continued to grow. A lot of what my lab focuses on is the actual technology of body composition assessment. We also employ different models of energy balance manipulation, ranging from intermittent fasting up to overfeeding. We're intentionally trying to overfeed participants. And then we conduct quite a bit of sports supplement and sports nutrition research as well.
That's really interesting because I think your line of research, it has a big deal of practical applications in the field, in energy expenditure, in body composition assessment, so on and so on. And speaking of body composition, this is I think a really complex topic because we assume, at least me as a practitioner and as a professor, that, okay, let's do this training protocol, this nutrition protocol, and then we're going to assess how people respond to this. They gain muscle, they lose fat, but the way we actually assess the outcome can modify the results, right? And we can get some false positives that, maybe intermittent fasting did lead to greater fat loss, but maybe it did not because of the way that we measured. So what I wanted to ask you to establish ground is, what is body composition, and specifically about the different compartment models, more specifically about the 4 compartment models that I know that you use, that it's categorized as the gold standard.
Yes, so you're certainly correct that the method you use is very important and affects, how confident we should be in our results. There are a few components here that I'll mention just briefly. I won't go into too much detail on this just for the sake of time. But, one question is how valid a method is. So how well does a particular method agree with what someone's true body composition would be? Of course, we can't really know someone's true body composition while they're alive. We would really have to dissect the body to know this. But as you mentioned, we have methods that are good enough that we consider them, say, a gold standard. So we'll kind of accept that as truth. And then all these other methods are more accessible. We see how close they are to this truth. So that's a component of the validity or accuracy of the technique. That does matter. But in the context of the study you're talking about, if you're trying to track changes over time, sometimes it's okay if a method is not in perfect agreement with the gold standard, as long as it can still track that change over time. So for example, if we have a participant starting out in a study, and one method says they're 20% body fat, and one method says they're 23% body fat, I actually don't care about that difference too much if both methods could track a change in body composition. Because in many of these studies, that's what we're concerned with, a change in body composition. So we already see that there's some context involved. Are we looking at a single assessment at one point in time? Are we trying to monitor changes? Kind of what are we concerned with? And something that's important if you're monitoring changes is having a device that's very reliable, meaning there's not a lot of noise or error if you're repeatedly assessing someone over a very short period of time. So if you assess someone one morning, you come back, assess them the next morning in the same conditions, and those values are very similar, we have a higher confidence that this is a reliable method. And typically those methods are the ones where you can more easily detect changes over time. So in terms of the 4-compartment model you mentioned, the compartments just refer to how we're breaking down body mass. So, most of us in the fitness industry certainly understand that body mass or body weight alone is not the best metric. We're concerned with what that mass is composed of. So most methods will use what's called a 2-compartment model, where all of body mass is split just into fat mass and fat-free mass. But fat-free mass is a very diverse component. That would include the water in your body, protein, glycogen, and minerals, for example. So the 4-compartment model takes some of those different components into account. So the 4-compartment model would break all body mass down into fat mass, and then typically water, bone mineral, and then what's called the residual compartment. And that would be the combination of protein, glycogen, and soft tissue mineral. So we could continue to split those out all the way to a 6-compartment model. Once you move past 4 compartments, you don't get a lot more accuracy by continuing to measure these very small components. Right. But you can certainly get more accuracy if you move from a 2-compartment model up to a 3 or 4-compartment model.
Yeah, because the way that we understand what is the method actually measuring, I think it can play a big part on how we interpret the results. So that's why I wanted to ask you about the most popular ones, which I'm sure you get asked about this a lot, which is number 1, DEXA, the gold standard, probably skinfolds, and obviously, and of course, bioelectrical impedance, because man, I gotta tell you, that one really tends to give a lot of headaches, and people in the field, in the practice, tend to interpret bioelectrical impedance like it's the ultimate truth. I've had clients that came from another person, and they tell me, oh, it's because I lost like 100 grams of muscle. Okay, and how do you know you lost 100 grams of muscle? Oh, because this machine told me, and it's really technological, things like that. But I wanted to ask you about those 3, which I think are the most, let's say, common: DEXA, skinfolds, and bioelectrical impedance. What are these machines actually measuring? Because, for instance, you already mentioned it, which I think is really, really funny, that the only way that we get to know exactly what our body fat percentage is when we're dead. So maybe you can tell your brothers and sisters, oh, he did pretty well. Unfortunately, he's dead, but he did gain some muscle, right? So I always find that really funny when I teach those classes. What can we, or else, let's put it that way. How do these methods actually work? What is, for instance, DEXA actually measuring, bioelectrical impedance actually measuring, and what are the pros and cons of these particular methods?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's really important to consider because most of these methods are measuring something, but then they're taking advantage of some relationship between what they measured and what we're actually interested in, which would be these body composition metrics. So for DEXA, for example, there are X-rays being passed through the body. So from an X-ray source, they're being passed through the body, and what the machine's actually looking at is how much those X-rays are kind of attenuated or how much they have their energy reduced as they pass through certain body tissue. And this isn't a two-dimensional imaging technique. So essentially at the end of the scan, you will have a two-dimensional image with all of these pixels. And for each pixel, the scanner essentially knows the energy of the X-rays that it produced, and then it knows the energy of what it received. And based on that, and based on kind of the known properties of bone mineral, fat tissue, and then lean tissue, it can estimate for any given pixel the proportion that is fat, that is lean, in this bone. So it's not a perfect technique. Many people will call it the gold standard.
Yeah.
I wouldn't personally agree with that, except when you need segmental analysis. So that's a big advantage because this is an imaging technique. You can separate different parts of the body very accurately. So you can separate the arms from the trunk. You can separate the legs from each other and from the trunk. So if you're trying to track changes, for example, in the legs specifically, say in a certain type of athlete, DEXA is very useful in that regard. And a four-compartment model cannot currently do that. So there would be good times you might want to use DEXA even instead of a four-compartment model. But that's actually what it's measuring. Again, how these X-rays are reduced as they pass through the body. So again, a very good technique, but not perfect. In terms of bioelectrical impedance analysis, that's an interesting one. So I will say what it's measuring, but I'll first mention this is a very broad category. Some people have access to very inexpensive kind of at-home body fat scales.
Yeah.
And even though they use a similar technology, these are not typically as accurate as some of the research grade devices. So some of the times where we see people, indicating their feelings that bioimpedance is a bad technology, sometimes they're kind of attributing what they see with these cheaper consumer devices kind of across the board. But we have cheap devices that are sometimes accurate, but usually not. And then we have more expensive devices that sometimes are more useful. With that said, they all do use the same general principle. And that principle is that you are in contact with electrodes, either kind of adhesive electrodes or just kind of flat plates like on a scale. And when you're in contact with those electrodes, there are small imperceptible currents that are passed into the body. So the device knows the frequency of current it's passing into the body. It knows kind of all those electrical characteristics. And because of the conductivity of body tissues, that current will travel through the body, and it travels more easily through tissues with more fluid, say skeletal muscle, for example, as compared to adipose tissue. But as it travels through the body, then it's received at other electrodes. So the device knows what it injected into the body, and it knows what it received. And from that, it'll characterize the bioelectrical properties of your tissues. From those actual measurements, so these bioelectrical properties, that's what it actually measures, that value is typically inserted into some type of regression equation or prediction equation within the device. And that will be used to estimate body water. Then from there, the body water typically is used to estimate fat-free mass. And from there, you can get metrics like body fat percentage.
Because just on itself, the daily fluctuations in body water, I think they can throw these machines off. And more particular, the commercial ones, the one that we usually have at home or anyone can buy. Let's say things that we didn't have breakfast, we did have breakfast. And one big one that I get seen all the time is menstrual cycle in women. All this stuff that can alter body water, it's obviously going to change the results. So I wanted to ask you, speaking of bioelectrical impedance, about one of your hundreds of papers, man, which is called Validity and this one's tough to pronounce, reliability of commercially available bioelectrical impedance analysis devices. Because I think it's pretty interesting, and it has a lot of what's it called? Ecological validity for us in the practice, I wanted to ask you, what did you did in the study, what did you find, and what can we conclude on bioelectrical impedance for the application of this method at home and maybe in when dealing with clients? And what are the maybe constraints of this technology?
Yeah, so that is, I'll do my best to summarize because we did a lot in that study. But you're right, we were trying to conduct a study that would be very applicable to individual consumers as well as, say, fitness professionals and coaches who might want some method of assessing their client's body composition. So in this study, and this data collection was led by one of my PhD students, Madeline Seidler, and she did a great job on this. But we essentially bought, about a dozen, 12 or so, of these consumer-grade body fat scales that you could purchase on Amazon.com or at your local retailers. And we brought those into our laboratory, and we tested a bunch of individuals with each of these devices, as well as several of our laboratory-grade BIA analyzers, and we also used DEXA, BodPod, and so on, so that we could generate a 4-compartment model. So for the same individuals, we had this valid method of body composition assessment in the laboratory, but we also had all these body composition metrics that they could get potentially at home. So across the devices, we saw some devices that performed incredibly poorly. You would not want to use them. If you were getting these data, it would actually probably be doing more harm than good. However, we did see a few that were quite a bit better. So even though some of these technologies look pretty similar, there were several that actually performed well. And we have that discussed. We have all the scales ranked in kind of just simple rankings in the article to try to make this easily digestible. I also have a kind of reader-friendly article about this exact study on my website that if someone's interested in seeing which specific scales performed well, that would probably be one of the easiest ways to get kind of the take-home message. Sure. But there were several scales ranging from, in the US, about $75 to about $250. There were several scales in that range that actually performed well enough that you could use them. You would still want to interpret with caution, but they performed quite a bit better than some of these other scales, which produced just very poor data.
Yeah, because at least here in Mexico, like I alluded in the beginning of this conversation, we usually tend to take it at face value. Like this machine, usually I'm sure there's no problem if we mention particular brands. Tanita, like we say here, Tanita, if you wanna put it in English. It's the most popular, that one and InBody. And the difference in prices, in price ranges, can go really, really, really up when we talk about later. So even then, I would like to ask you about what's the difference between, let's say, commercially available for most people, Tanita, and then maybe more high-end bioelectrical impedance machine. I think one of the difference, before giving the microphone to you, it's the amount of, I don't know how to put it in English. One has just one electrical current, I think, and the other one has two, something along those lines, and can make a big difference. Can we talk a little bit about that, dig a little bit deeper?
Yes, absolutely. And you're right. I was just pulling it up in the background here so I could tell you, but we did assess several Tanita devices. We did assess an InBody device as well. The device many people are familiar with are the very nice ones, the very expensive ones, like the 770, for example. But InBody does actually make a device that's more directed towards consumers. In the United States, it looks like it's a little over $300 currently. It's called the H2ON, and that is one of the devices we tested, and it was one of our better performing devices. There were a couple Tanita devices that performed very well, also relative to the other consumer devices. But you're certainly right that all of these consumer grade scales typically have a single frequency that is used in terms of the electrical current. There's minor exception. I think InBody might actually use 2 frequencies. But if we compare that to our laboratory grade devices, the laboratory grade devices can use anywhere from 15 to 256 frequencies. So we have some devices, again, that within the course of a couple of seconds will pass, again, over 250 electrical frequencies into the body. And kind of that full spectrum allows it to model body fluids a little bit more accurately. And there are some good laboratory devices that can use a single frequency, but in general, multiple frequencies are better. They allow you to look at more nuanced variables. For example, the water that's inside your cells as compared to outside your cells, which is of interest in a variety of contexts. Yes, did I answer your question, or was there more you wanted to discuss there?
Totally. Frequency was the word. I'm sorry, man. I got lost in my own thoughts.
Oh, no, you're great. You're great.
Yeah, and I think this particular method, multi-frequency bioelectrical impedance, can be used, or at least has been used, in a particular context that comes to mind. Let's say the peak week for a bodybuilder. I think it was used by Chris Barrocott and his team to actually measure the amount of intracellular body water and extracellular body water in regards to the carb loading and several practices, right? Do you think these methods on that particular context can be trusted? Can be a good method on itself?
Yeah, so I'll say that I had a small role in that study you're talking about, and chatted with Chris about it. But something we talked about that we fully disclosed there is that when, say, a bodybuilder is going through peak week, they're violating a lot of assumptions of the device. So we understood that. I think because of that, we think you should interpret with caution some of those fluid estimates. However, I do think there is potential if you're looking at the actual raw variables, like you were talking about earlier. What is the technology actually measuring? If you look at the actual bioelectrical properties, so these tissue properties, which are normally used to estimate body fluid, and instead of using them to estimate body fluid, you kind of interpret them on their own. I think there's more potential there because you're not making some of those assumptions about kind of what a normal fluid distribution would be. And again, as you're mentioning, bodybuilders, say in a peak week, are doing a lot of things that could be, again, violating the assumptions and causing the actual fluid estimates to not always be accurate. So the short answer is we don't know for sure how applicable it is. It's something that has been looked at. If it is determined to be valid in that context, that might be very useful. But currently, it's kind of an area of exploration.
That's really interesting. And before digging into Eric's case study, because I found it really, really interesting, I wanted to ask you about two that are really common. One I already mentioned, which is skin folds. What are skin folds actually measuring? And at least in my own understanding, which is really limited, the really big problem with several formulas and how we interpret this data. And the second one, it's I don't know how to put it. It's really useful, but I wanted to ask your particular opinion on it, which is the US Navy formula, because it's so simple and it can be applied to so many people, maybe online coaching, I don't know. How reliable is it in that context? Because I know that's not something you're going to use in research and so on. But first, skin folds. Can we talk about the pros and cons of those?
Yes, so there definitely are some pros of skin folds. This is widely accessible. It gives you really interesting information segmentally, so you can look at different regions of the body. You can argue that for a lot of people who are interested in physique, it's more directly measuring something you're interested in, because what it's measuring, it really is the thickness of a double layer of subcutaneous fat as well as skin. So really subcutaneous adipose tissue. So a couple of things here. It can be a great method if you do it right, but there are two major barriers. One is how skilled the assessor is. Right. So if you have someone who's very, very well trained, they're very good at assessing skin folds, that's fantastic. There are international protocols that people can get certified through. ISAC is a big one, International Society of Kin Anthropometry. So if you have a very good assessor, that's sort of half the battle. The other component is choosing the correct equation. So as you mentioned, there are a variety of equations. Each equation was developed in a specific group of people. We have some data that are about to be published in this area with some Italian collaborators who worked with professional soccer players, football players in Italy. And essentially one of the major conclusions was the one previous equation that had been developed in a similar population of elite soccer football players was quite a bit more accurate than these more general equations that are applied. So it's certainly one of those cases where you need very accurate, say, input data, the actual quality of the skin folds, and you also need to appropriately select an equation. So because of that, it's a little bit challenging, even research on skin folds, because it's hard to know if the assessor used in a research study is the same as the practitioner who is reading and interpreting these results. So that's one reason we don't do a lot of research on skin folds. It's a good method, but it's difficult to produce research on skin folds and say, yeah, this will definitely apply elsewhere because we don't know the quality of the assessor. But again, it is a good method when performed correctly. There are many people who advocate for this, but an advantage of it also, beyond inserting all these values into an equation, is just to look at the actual raw skin fold thicknesses. Because then you can see overall, is the subcutaneous adipose tissue on the body increasing or decreasing? And you can also look at specific sites, which particularly at higher training levels, there might be physique-oriented individuals who are particularly concerned with certain sites. So if they have a good assessor and look at those sites, it can be a useful method. In terms of the Navy equation, and I'll say more broadly, any of these equations that are using things like circumferences to estimate body fat, it's well known that they are not very good at the individual level. These types of equations really had their origins in the need for an assessment that could be performed quickly, cheaply, in a large variety of contexts. So I would say there are a lot of limitations to them. An area I think is a little more promising in that realm is 3D scanning. Our lab does a lot of work with 3D scanning, and now even just from your phone, you can get a fairly accurate representation of the size and shape of the body. And you can pull more advanced circumferences. So you can pull the waist circumference at its narrowest point on this avatar, which is easier than a human trying to make that decision. You can pull all types of limb circumferences, different ratios between circumferences, all from an avatar that was very reliably produced. So these technologies in general have very high reliability. So that's kind of an application where I think some of these circumference-based equations may have a little bit more promise than they did traditionally, because they can be implemented and more advanced equations can be produced with technologies like 3D scanning.
Man, that's a lot to unpack and a lot to dig in on all of those topics. But I wanted to talk about the case study of Mr. Eric Helms, because I found it really interesting, because when you see his photos, when you see him posing, he's clearly lean. How could someone like that be 28% body fat, right? And if we are no, go ahead, please.
Oh yeah. So his range was from on DEXA was his lowest at 8.3% body fat, and then his highest actually was on a Tanita scale, so one of the Tanita home scales. It was actually one of the better performers in our group study, but that was not in lean physique athletes, and he got 17% with that device. So if you, I won't share the full details because it would be a lengthy discussion, but in short, this actually goes back to what we were discussing with the 4-compartment model. Because of all the assessments we did in our laboratory, we were able to look at Eric's fat-free mass characteristics. So we were able to see how dense his fat-free mass was, what the proportion of water was, and so on. And essentially, the reason why some of those at-home body fat scales estimated him very high is because his properties of his fat-free mass were different than is assumed by the device. So for example, the device assumes that you have a certain percentage of water in your fat-free mass. And Eric deviated from that pretty substantially. So because of that, it appeared that he had higher body fat, when in reality he didn't. Our better methods had him much leaner. So that can happen to other individuals as well, not just lean physique athletes. But you could have clients where, based on your experience as a practitioner, you're looking at them and you might think they have a certain body composition, but then they get some test result, say from a bioimpedance scale, and it's just way off. You can tell it's way off. It could be due to their different fat-free mass properties. It could also be due to something like a lack of standardization. So if they perform that assessment after they've been eating or exercising, something like that, they're not wearing the same clothing, all of those can introduce error. In the case of the case study, we did control all these items. So, Eric was rested, fasted, hydrated. We kind of had gone through the whole protocol to make sure we had high quality data. So even when you standardize, you can have some of these errors. They're just due to inherent differences of the particular individual you're assessing.
With all of this in mind, what do you think would be the best recommendations for each particular context? Let's say in research, well, you guys really need to be precise because you're trying to measure muscle growth, you're trying to measure fat loss with a particular protocol, but maybe it's not the same need for that precision in in a nutritional practice for a trainer, let's say for a personal trainer, but that doesn't mean that we can use whatever we want and mix all the results and get confused like we usually do. So let's say for someone that's following a nutritional and training protocol at home, they have an online coach, what would you think would be a good enough method to estimate the changes in body composition?
Yeah. So first, I'll say that body composition in that context really is just one outcome to consider. Even if someone's goal is fat loss or muscle growth, you certainly want to be considering other supportive metrics like performance in the gym, kind of their subjective assessment of how their clothes fit, how they feel like they look. Some of these components kind of really will all tie together to your holistic interpretation. If you had someone who did not, say they were a virtual client and they did not have any ability to get assessed by, say, a valid laboratory method, then probably something as simple as a flexible tape measure tracking certain circumferences like waist circumference, upper arm circumference, thigh circumference, and so on. That would be something someone could probably assess fairly reliably on their own if their coach, say, talked them through how to do this. It's not particularly complicated, but you'd still want to ensure they're measuring these circumferences correctly. If they did have someone who could assist them with this, taking some skin folds as well could be helpful, as long as the assessor is consistent and understands how to take those values. But with an online client, you may not have that. It may just be them. They don't have a partner or friend who can assist them with those assessments. So in those cases, I would say do assess body mass, even though that's not all we want to interpret. It's still one point you want to look at. And then circumferences. That would be sort of a bare minimum. And then I wouldn't overemphasize those items, but you could draw some inferences. If you have a client who's more of a beginner and they're starting out and you might expect some simultaneous fat loss and muscle gain, tracking those circumferences may help. If you see, say, body mass is decreasing a little bit, you're seeing waist circumference decrease, but say they've added in a higher resistance training volume, and they're seeing certain circumferences increase, say an upper arm circumference in someone who is minimally trained, you might be able to piece together kind of the idea that, you may be gaining muscle in some of these sites you haven't trained heavily before, like your arms, but we also see some weight loss occurring, waist circumferences going down. Say this is someone who, that's a site where they tend to hold fat. That would be a good sign for fat loss, even without giving them a specific percentage or a number. You could kind of piece together this idea. So something along those lines is probably what I'd recommend for the context of, say, an online client without access to a lot of these devices. Again, 3D scanning is nice in that it can assess lots of these circumferences for you automatically. So there's several free apps available and more that are coming to market. That might be an easy way as well for them to get a lot of information without having to try to perform these assessments on themselves.
Right. And what do you think about the visual guidelines? Because I think it would be interesting to, let's say, get some coaches that have a lot of experience just by looking at people and maybe estimating the ranges of body fat and actually measuring. Do you think there's some use in these images, or maybe it just adds more to the confusion?
That's a great question. Actually, when Eric was here, we were sort of joking about that, and it'd be an interesting study, but running a study where one of the methods was just kind of an expert assessor.
Yeah.
I do think that people who have a lot of experience coaching clients, performing body composition assessments, and so on, honestly, I think their guess would be better than some of these methods we see. So some of the worst at-home body fat scales, for example, for some individuals, I'd trust them more to give me a guesstimate of body fat percentage. With that said, those charts certainly can be a little bit either intentionally deceptive or misleading. As we know, different people carry their body fat differently. Some people can maintain, relatively low subcutaneous fat, and they might appear leaner than they would actually be if we assess them with one of these devices. Similarly, just different regions on the body. There might be people who have a relatively lean upper body. So if you're going based off guidelines about whether or not abs are visible, for example, you might assume they're leaner, but in reality, they're just carrying a lot more of their body fat, say in their hips and glutes and areas like that. So, it's certainly not a perfect method because of differences in body fat distribution and so on. But again, there's something to be said for the experience of a practitioner in performing those kind of visual assessments.
Yeah, because we usually tend to joke a lot about that. Some people just look at you and they go, you have something percent body fat. You need something amount of calories. But maybe with the experience of some people, some coaches, maybe that they're not that far off as we might think. So I hope that study gets done one day. I'm sure, well, I'm not sure because I'm not into research, but I think it could be complicated, right? To standardize how one looks at body fat.
Yeah, it would be hard. The biggest challenge would be similar to what I mentioned with the skin folds. It would be an interesting study, but we couldn't really translate it elsewhere because it would just be one person's subjective opinion of how someone looks. So it's kind of, it would be difficult to do. Maybe you could get some like de-identified photographs or something to include with it, and then other people could have their assessments. But yeah, it would be an interesting study, but again, just hard to translate. You couldn't directly use that to mean that anyone who's performing a visual assessment would be accurate, because of course that's each person's own, subjective opinion. But maybe you could get a group of assessors or something like that.
Right, that's really interesting. And I wanted to ask you one, well, almost final thing to be respectful of your time. In that case, in Eric Holmes's case, well, you guys are on top of the academic hierarchy, so there's no issue there. But maybe someone that's into fitness, that's getting lean, gets the news that they're 18% body fat. I can imagine that can be heart-wrenching. So for people that are just into fitness in general, what advice would you give that can give them a little bit of calm and teach them how to actually measure body fat percentage changes on their own personal journey and preparations, to not get frustrated by the numbers on itself? I don't know if I'm being clear with the question.
Yes. Yeah, so first I would say, if you're just interested in improving your fitness and health, there's nothing that says you have to track your body composition. There are definitely some individuals where, mentally, psychologically, maybe it will harm you more than it helps you to have this information, to be stressing about body fat percentage. Similarly, to be stressing about the scale, to be stressing about circumferences. If you can make improvements in your health without monitoring that's completely fine. If you are someone who wants that information or maybe is motivated by that information in a positive way, then I would say a couple things. One, understand that no matter how scientific the device looks, it has some degree of error. Even if you're going in and getting a DEXA scan performed in a research laboratory, there's some margin of error. So if it's a very small change, for example, say you started your fitness journey and a particular device said you were 18% body fat, and then a couple of months later it said you were 18.5% body fat. That 0.5% is small enough that it's probably within the error of almost any device, meaning that we're not actually confident your body fat increased. So I'd be skeptical of small changes. Once you see larger changes occurring and they're kind of sustained over time, then you can be more confident real changes occurred. However, you'll probably have noticed that on your own. You may have noticed your clothes fitting differently, better performance in the gym, differences in the way you look, and so on. So again, if you don't have access to great techniques, you can make a case for just monitoring those more subjective factors and not fixating on the number. But again, if you do get the number, understand there's some error involved, and remember, it's just one metric. It's not the only number that matters. It's just kind of one piece of the puzzle, which is your overall health and fitness.
And one big one, I'm sorry, that you already mentioned is your performance in the gym.
Yeah.
People tend to overlook this, at least in Mexico. They don't really pay attention to that. They don't really write anything down from their training. They just trust blindly on the bioelectrical impedance device, and that's it. It said that you lost muscle. Okay, wait a minute, but you're getting stronger. You're performing better in the gym overall. So how can, at least, maybe we're not coaching the training side, just the nutritional side, with a client, what would be the advice you could give to pay attention to performance? Maybe numbers, maybe what precisely would you advise?
Yeah, so I'd say tracking numbers, and this doesn't mean you have to track, every repetition on every set. For some individuals, you might want to do that. But say for a client who's starting out, it could certainly be another positive metric that could encourage them if you perform some say basic, strength assessments. This doesn't have to be a 1 repetition maximum, but some strength assessments, some muscular endurance assessments, just kind of a baseline fitness profile. You can include certainly other aspects of fitness, cardiorespiratory endurance and so on if you wanted to. But tracking some of those metrics periodically, because we know that you can improve all these metrics with training. So this would be another way, say there's someone who their body composition does not change as quickly as they would like. This would still be a point of encouragement to show them the progress they're making in the gym. Or another situation you mentioned, if they're having kind of large changes in these body composition test results, it can kind of help steady them and say, no, I think, there's some error in this device. You need to remember, you clearly haven't lost a ton of muscle. Visually, you look at least as muscular as you were. Your performance is better than it was. So it's kind of those performance metrics can be another way to contextualize the body composition, and just another way you can encourage, say, a client with their progress with a fitness program.
Right. That's pretty interesting. And just on a final note to finish off, with what frequency would you recommend for someone to assess their body mass, circumferences, performance in the gym?
That's really hard. There are some. No, it's fine. There's some individuals who seem to benefit from very frequent body mass check-ins. For other individuals, that can be very detrimental because they'll see minor changes due to differences in body water, intestinal contents, and so on, and have an issue there. So there's not one best frequency. I think it really depends on the client and maybe having a discussion with them if they have any experience with tracking their body mass on how it affects them psychologically. Something that might be in between would be something like a weekly weigh-in under standardized procedures, kind of same day of the week, same procedures. And then even from there, taking an average across a couple weeks or even a month if you're dealing with a really long-term situation. Certainly I've heard of some individuals who are assessing their body mass throughout the day. You certainly don't want to do that because you want a fasted assessment first thing in the morning. But I know there are people who may lack the information and tend to obsess with the scale. All those same things apply to the body composition assessments. You typically want longer durations between the body composition assessments. If you're doing something as simple as circumferences or like a 3D scan at home, you could do it as frequently as weekly, but you're likely not going to see large changes in that time. So you could make a case for something more like monthly or just what's reasonable based on your program. If you've been kind of at one nutritional phase in your program for a couple of months, it may make sense to perform an assessment before transitioning to another phase of the program, whether that's another step down in calories, another step up in calories, whatever it may be. So there are a variety of ways to do this, but just think about what makes sense. Not perform the assessments too frequently. Perform that at times that makes sense given kind of the program the client is on. But I don't have a best answer for you. There are some people that say you shouldn't do it more than 4 times per year. But I know that, for some individuals, they'll go through a lot of phases during that time, and they would really like to capture more information than that.
Right. And I totally understand. It was just a question that I wanted to ask you specifically, but I know it can be answered like, oh yeah, do it monthly, do it weekly, because I know there's a lot of factors that can go into play. And maybe we can switch between frequencies. Like, for instance, some client isn't apparently losing weight. Maybe in that particular context, do you think it would be appropriate to, let's say weigh-ins daily for a week, 2 weeks, then get an average, and then we'll find out if you're actually stuck?
Yes, no, absolutely. And those periods where maybe you have a client who you expect to stay relatively weight stable. Maybe they're relatively well trained, they're even not well trained, but you don't expect they're not particularly overweight, for example. That'd be another case for body composition assessment where you can try to see what's going on, even if someone's weight is staying stable. Body mass, body composition ideally would kind of complement each other, even if they're being performed at different frequencies.
Right. And just to finish off, I wanted to ask you, what upcoming research do you have in hand, in mind? What's coming for us, man? Because your particular line is super interesting and always, like I told you, really, it has a lot of practical applications for us. So thanks for that, man. For you and on your...
Yeah, no, thank you. The couple of studies we're going to be working on this semester, one is continuing testing some prototypes of 3D scanners from iPhones and Android phones, just looking at how we can more accurately perform these 3D scans just from this technology that most of us have in our pockets. The other is one of my students, Madeline's dissertation, and it's going to be looking at thyroid hormones and suppressed metabolism in active women who are taking oral contraceptives. So essentially, we'll be looking at whether or not assessing the metabolism by indirect calorimetry, which is where we're just collecting all the air someone's exhaling, whether that can be used essentially as a easier way to predict suppressed metabolism or lowered metabolism as compared to looking at actual thyroid hormones. So we'll perform blood draws and look at actual thyroid hormone levels. And when they're suppressed, we'll view these people as actually metabolically suppressed. And we'll essentially be seeing if we can detect that with these different indirect calorimetry-based procedures. So those are
super
two of the
interesting.
main ones we're working on. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, because that's one of the topics that always comes into play when people apparently with thyroid conditions they can lose weight and all of that, and then putting oral contraceptives. Well, I don't know which kind, but man, that sounds really interesting. Looking forward for that one.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So, Dr. Tinsley, I don't want to take any more of your time because I already did. Thanks a lot for taking the time. Thanks a lot for your research, for your insights. So I wanted to extend the invitation. Anytime you want to come down to Mexico, you're more than welcome.
I appreciate that. I may take you up on that. And I appreciate the conversation, Daniel. Thank you for having me on here. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks to you, man. Have a great day.
Absolutely.